Hi, Dr. Gonzalez. Thank you so much for joining me today. Students, Dr. Gonzalez is a sociocultural anthropologist and assistant professor at Mount St. Vincent University in Halifax, and she's a very dear friend of mine as well, who's offered to have a conversation that you get to listen in on about her project with humans and monarch butterflies and migration across North America. And for Dr. Gonzalez's doctoral research, she explored how different communities of Canada, Mexico, and the United States engage with the endangered monarch butterfly migration. And her current work connects the decline of monarch butterflies with other social and ecological problems that North Americans in all three countries face, from climate change to the agri-food industry. So welcome, Dr. Gonzalez. And to start us off, could you describe your research project, Convergent Migrations?
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm very pleased to be doing this for your group. I also want to say that Sarah Williams and we shared this interest in doing anthropology in Mexico and an engaged anthropology. So I'm very glad to be present today at your class. Thank you for inviting me.
You're welcome.
So my project, Convergent Migrations, is about different people and non-humans that move across North America. So what I'm trying to do after all these years following the monarch butterfly across North America is to talk about other non-humans that move across North America and humans that move across North America. So for example, we have the movement that your students probably know about monarchs coming from Canada through United States and Mexico, hibernating in Mexico, and then returning back to prairie habitat in United States and Canada. But we also have movement of GMO corn, for example, that is produced in the Midwest region of United States or the Corn Belt region of Canada, and that it migrates through NAFTA arrangements to Mexico and is now part of the Mexican market. So I also follow those migrations from north to south. And finally, I'm trying to make connections of how we also have movement from south to north of humans migrating from Mexico to United States and Canada. And then I find they have these convergent migrations at my sites of study.
Great. So your work involves a lot of conversation and collaboration with people who are trying to protect monarch butterflies, and not just the butterflies, but the habitats, the milkweed, like your beautiful slide shows, that they need to survive. Can you describe how governments tend to approach ecological conservation?
Good question, thank you. Yes, the slide I have here is just to give your viewers a better sense of the migration of monarchs and how I did this multi-sited and multi-species ethnography following the monarchs across this territory. And my findings the first years is that, at least for this species that is a trinational species, is that it's protected trinationally, but with the complexities of having national borders. So each government has its own agenda to protect its national species, so its national monarch. And at the same time, they are trying to work under the NAFTA umbrella.
And the NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement,
yes,
between Mexico, Canada, and the US.
Yes, so this species is protected under NAFTA, and with the idea of protecting the shared environment of North America. But as I said, we have these complexities of working within the concept of national borders. Often the type of conservation that I see is one that is too focused in the local or national level and not too interested in a really transboundary conservation that even questions the idea of borders and that questions why do we have them at place. In that sense, what I have registered across the years is that this was a top-down model that will not account for other knowledge that is not scientific knowledge.
Mm-hmm. And that's important in part because the monarch isn't American and it isn't Canadian and it isn't Mexican. It's has a habitat that spans the entire continent almost.
Yeah, and this slide is good to show that if you don't have healthy monarchs in what I call their milkweed country, for example, you won't have healthy monarchs in what we call today Canada, and you won't have healthy monarchs in what we call today Mexico. So it really, following these species, it really pushed my boundaries of thinking beyond borders and how these um, imagined geographies are so obsolete to really protect humans and non-humans.
Mm-hmm. So, can you tell me what is traditional or indigenous ecological knowledge and the difference between the two? Because, of course, TEK, traditional ecological knowledge, tends to be how much of the literature describes indigenous ecological knowledge. And what does it offer or accomplish that Western-oriented conservation practices can't?
So, yeah, thanks for this question. I start using the term TK before I really knew more about this category and what we can do for conservation. Traditional ecological knowledge is a term acquainted maybe around 20 years ago with the idea of including traditional knowledge and their practices in biodiversity conservation projects. Is now very much implemented across many conservation projects in the world. When I started working with Indigenous communities in Canada, with the idea of finding more about the knowledge that they have of monarchs and their habitat, I did face answers related with questioning what is traditional knowledge, why we as Indigenous groups are labeled as traditional. Maybe we have Indigenous knowledge, but not necessarily traditional knowledge. To me, that was very powerful because it is true that the category of TEK may reproduce the same inequalities that we are trying to overcome with these kind of projects, assuming that that's the traditional knowledge, that's the knowledge that is not scientific, that's the knowledge that is anecdotal, for example. So I'm trying to take a distance from that category of traditional, thinking in terms of indigenous ecological knowledge, which is knowledge that is also a form of science, but it's indigenous science. And what was your second question about what it can achieve?
Yeah, what does indigenous ecological knowledge offer or accomplish that Western-oriented conservation practices maybe can't?
So I will say one important aspect of it is that it assumes that knowledge is always contextual, it's always changing, and it's always dependent on how people are interacting, in this case, with their environment. And so that's a very important factor for us anthropologists, that we're trying always to sense, those structures of feelings or agencies or everyday practices that build the world in the way we know it. So that's one aspect, that paying attention to it, it really lets you understand what's going on across those human-nature relationships as they are taking place. The other very important factor is that, at least these are my findings in working in this corridor, is that it really thinks those nature-human interactions in more holistic terms. It's very hard to compartmentalize, to categorize, sorry, each of those knowledges as this one is knowledge about the land, this one is knowledge about the water, this one is knowledge about the butterfly. It just doesn't work like that.
Mm-hmm.
You will always have those, that is a knowledge that is transversal of all those factors. Whereas in scientific knowledge, what we have is pretty much thinking in terms of a species. We're just going to protect monarchs, or even in terms of the species itself, different categories. Is this historical knowledge? Is this present knowledge? Is this knowledge in practice? You wouldn't find those categories when you're studying indigenous ecological knowledge. That makes it complex for the ethnographer and for policy making, for sure, but it's much more integrated with the reality of what it means to understand those humans and nature relationships.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So I know that you've worked directly with some conservation projects that are Indigenous led or that heavily incorporate Indigenous ecological knowledge. And can you maybe describe one of those projects? What does it look like and how does it work to incorporate all of these multiplicities of contexts and environments?
Yeah. So I start getting involved with indigenous knowledge as a consultant project, actually for the CEC, which is an agency of NAFTA. It's like the environmental side of NAFTA, and it was a very was a superficial project in the sense we just map out the information that was already published about knowledge, indigenous knowledge about these species, monarchs. And we work in United States and Mexico, gathering that data. The findings were very interesting. Uh, we found that in United States, what we could call traditional, for example, is occurring among communities we call butterfly amateurs. So that's actually the tradition in United States to protect monarchs, and it's not indigenous. And they sight butterflies, they rear them at home, they protect them at home, they tag them, and but it's not necessarily indigenous knowledge. What we found in Mexico was more related with indigenous knowledge, and that's that monarchs do have a relevance in the area in which they overwinter for those indigenous communities. Not necessarily that they are more important than other species, but they do have a symbolic power. This is not something that we found in United States, although I do want to call attention to the image that you have there. Um, that is a few of the registers that we found of, this is a Lakota tribe, indigenous man, known by his Western name as Sitting Bull, and he was imprisoned. And this picture taken when he was imprisoned shows he's wearing a monarch butterfly in that hat. So to me, that's one of the oldest registers and more interesting registers, also showing that Native American groups in United States, some of them, bestow power to butterflies in general, not necessarily monarchs, but to butterflies. So there's a speculation that someone pinned that butterfly to give him strength at those difficult times. He was actually imprisoned at Standing Rock. So we do have those registers in the United States, but the continuity of them, because of the history with Native American communities in the United States, is so, most of them were expelled from the lands, and it really halted that possibility of keeping the knowledge connected with where they live. We don't have many registers.
Mm-hmm.
In these changes in Mexico, where we do have historical registers from pre-colonial times, all the images that you have here are showing, again, butterflies, clearly not monarchs. There's no interest in distinguishing these species as more important than others. But we do have jewelry, different stones, grave stones, that are showing the importance and the relevance of insects in general, but also of butterflies. And most of these are also goddess representations. And finally, in Mexico, there's a continuum from pre-colonial traditions of seeing insects and butterflies as carriers of the soul of ancestors. So for this region in Mexico where monarchs hibernate, we have found that there is consistent beliefs of monarchs being the carriers of the soul of ancestors that arrive in the area for Day of the Dead.
Mm.
So all the images that you have here, some of them more modern than others, do point out to that mobilization and belief of the monarch as an emblematic species during Day of the Dead.
Okay. And just for some students who might not be aware, Day of the Dead or Dia de los Muertos is November 1st, and it's, or yeah, no,
First and two. Yeah.
1st and 2nd, and it's when the souls of the deceased and deceased family and friends come back to this world to visit with family and to say hi.
Exactly. So in that sense, the butterfly, the monarch butterfly has a specific power in the region during those days. And this could be used for conservation purposes even more. Like if agencies want to use this or incorporate this knowledge to protect the butterfly, but I will say that communities themselves, they want to protect the butterfly because, as I said to me sometimes, I don't want to kill my uncle. You know, if there's real belief system thinking that those butterflies represent or carry the soul of their ancestors that day, so in that sense they are meaningful and they want to protect them just as much as a scientific community, the scientific community wants to protect them.
Perhaps even more.
Perhaps even more, exactly, because you know this sort of keen relationship with non-humans that we see among other indigenous groups in North America.
Mm-hmm.
So I just wanted to show you very quickly another sacralized use of nature, which goes beyond monarchs. These are mediated by, you know, a hybrid of the Western Catholic tradition after colonization and indigenous traditions. So these sacralized mountains is places where people do rituals to do petitions for water or a good harvest across the year. So this is also the way in which people mediate the relationship with nature. And to me, these kind of mediations are actually what counts as a possible good indigenous knowledge to integrate in conservation measures.
Mm-hmm. So in your experience, why is Indigenous ecological knowledge often excluded from conservation planning?
Good question. Because it's complex. If you're thinking what we have been talking today, it's not only that this monarch is important because it represents the soul of ancestors, but it's part of that complex belief system that sees the milpa, which is the family garden, as sacred, and then the upper mountain as sacred. And to integrate that in a conservation model that wants to do a core zone without humans free and a periphery zone in which humans can do certain activities that scientists think that are good for the environment, it's just hard to really consider that indigenous knowledge first as valid and then to be open to plan and design different conservation measures that account for the complexity of this knowledge.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned something that to me seems really key, which is that in like Western scientific conservation and ecological practices, we have this idea of the human as being not belonging in nature. And, you know, a really good conservation area has no humans living in it, just animals, non-human animals. But that really doesn't align with traditional or indigenous ecological practices because humans are a part of the ecosystem. Yeah, go on.
Yeah, for sure, exactly. That's the boundaries that an indigenous ecological project will push. We want to protect this nature, but we want to protect it with us being part of it, with us constructing nature and nature constructing us, right? And recognizing that deep interplay between natures and humans is something that science has detached from. You have seen this in your classes, I'm sure. It's a modern project of that is anthropocentric, that is Eurocentric, that centers the humans as separate from nature, able to tame that nature or able to take decisions upon that nature. And whereas what we see in indigenous groups that have been living in those areas, at least here, we're talking about um, thousands of years. Really, these communities have been there for thousands of years. They have developed a relationship with nature in which they make it and nature makes them.
Mhm. Well, great. This has been so wonderful, Dr. Gonzalez. Do you have anything you would like to leave my students with that we haven't discussed already?
I think this is good for now. I'm always open for questions. If they want to check my website, you can share it over there. They can email me there. I have more information on the projects I'm working now. And yeah, I always leave my students with two recommendations when it comes to indigenous knowledge. Is one, I recommend this book called Native Science of Gregory Kajiti, that has this very interesting approach of reshuffling our idea of science as two different spheres, and considering that indigenous science is also science. Um, and the other recommendation I would like to share is that if your students at some point are interested in doing some kind of project or researching, the the only ways these projects will be effective is if they start at the community level. We have to integrate the communities in the planning, the budget, and all the steps of a research project to really make it inclusive.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Not a problem. It was great to see you here, and bye.